And finally, I have to thank the one person who has been my true inspiration, the visionary who helped me reshape this brand for the future, my brilliant wife, Amanda. I heard the words. I saw my son, David, say them into the microphone. The lights were hot and white, and they made his face shine. The applause that followed felt distant, like the sound was coming from the other side of a thick glass wall. I was sitting at a table near the back, table 17. They'd put me there, next to Frank, my old flower supplier, probably so the important people could have the front seats. I watched David's eyes as he spoke. That's the thing that haunts me. It wasn't just that he was lying. It was that he wasn't. There was no flicker of guilt, no nervous tick, no quick glance in my direction to see if I was watching. Nothing. His eyes were clear and bright and utterly sincere. He was telling his truth. And in his truth, I didn't exist. He had built this new story so completely in his own mind that he genuinely believed it. He believed that the business began the day Amanda, with her marketing degree and her sharp, sensible shoes, walked into his life. He believed the recipes, my mother's recipes, my grandmother's recipes, were just some raw, archaic foundation that he and his brilliant wife had cleverly breathed new life into. He wasn't my son standing on that stage, accepting the Business of the Year award. He was a stranger performing a role he had written for himself, a successful innovator, a visionary. Amanda squeezed his hand, her smile perfectly polished, the kind you practice in a mirror. It didn't reach her eyes. Her eyes were scanning the room, counting the journalists, assessing the value of the moment. The applause washed over me. People were standing. Frank, beside me, stayed seated. He was a big man, his hands thick and dusted with the memory of 1,000 flour sacks. He just looked at his water glass. He didn't need to look at me. We both knew. David held up the glass trophy. It caught the light and shattered it into 100 pieces. He thanked the Chamber of Commerce, his marketing team, the new landlord who gave him a deal on the expanded space. He thanked everyone. Everyone except the woman who sold her own car 30 years ago to buy the bakery's first commercial mixer. Everyone except the woman whose hands were permanently scarred from the old oven racks. The name Eleanor was never spoken. It was a ghost in that room, a word that had been carefully, methodically erased from the script. And in that moment, sitting at table 17, I didn't feel anger. Not yet. That came later. What I felt was a cold, quiet, terrifying clarity. The problem wasn't that my son was ungrateful. It was so much worse than that. The problem was that he had erased me from his own memory. And I realized, with a stillness that settled deep in my bones, that you can't reason with a person who has rewritten history. You can't appeal to a memory that has been surgically removed. The ceremony ended. People swarmed the stage. I watched men in expensive suits shake David's hand. I saw Amanda give a tight, triumphant hug to a woman with a press badge. I was invisible. A relic from the archaic tradition they were so proud to have broken from. I stood up, my knees stiff. Frank put a heavy hand on my arm for just a second. "I remember your mother's apple cake, Ellie," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Heard she won 3 county fair ribbons with it. Shame the boy forgot." He didn't say it with malice. He said it with a deep, weary sadness, the way you'd talk about a crop failure or a long drought. It was just a fact, a truth, and it was the only real thing I had heard all night. I didn't wait to congratulate them. What would I have said? Congratulations on building your success on my ghost? I walked out of the banquet hall, the false laughter and the clinking glasses fading behind me. The night air was cold and bit at my cheeks. I drove home in complete silence. The radio was off. The heavy glass award, which David had thrust into my hands with a distracted, "Here, Mom, can you take this?" as someone else pulled him away for a photo, sat on the passenger seat. It felt like a tombstone. The city lights smeared across the windshield, and I just focused on the road, my hands gripping the steering wheel. I could see the faint tracery of white scars on my knuckles, a map of old burns and cuts. Hands that knew the difference between dough that was ready and dough that needed another 10 minutes. Hands that remembered the weight of a 50-pound sack of Frank's best bread flour. When I got home, the house was quiet, too quiet. It was the same quiet it had been for years, but tonight it felt different. It was an empty quiet, a hollowed-out quiet. I took off my coat, the one I only wear to funerals and special occasions, and hung it carefully in the closet. I walked into the kitchen and placed my handbag on the old wooden table. Next to it, I set down the gift bag from the event. Then I just stood there for a long time, maybe an hour. The only sound was the low hum of the refrigerator and the tick-tock of the old cat-shaped clock on the wall, its tail swinging back and forth. Tick-tock. A relentless, steady measurement of time. I sat down at the table and stared at the wood grain, tracing the patterns with my eyes. I wasn't thinking. I was just feeling the silence, feeling the hollowness spread from my chest out to my fingertips. The shock was wearing off, and underneath it was something cold and heavy. My hand, moving on its own, reached for the gift bag. Inside was a glossy, heavy-stock brochure, printed for the awards night. The new era of Eleanor's Hearth, the cover read. They still used my name, or the memory of my name. I opened it. The photos were beautiful. The bread was artfully arranged on rustic wooden boards with scattered crumbs that looked like they had been placed with tweezers. Everything was lit perfectly. It didn't look like food. It looked like an advertisement for a feeling. I turned a page and saw a section titled, Our Philosophy. There was a quote from Amanda. It's about respecting the past, but not being chained to it. We're breaking with archaic traditions to create a culinary experience that is bold, modern, and forward-thinking. Archaic traditions. My mother, rolling out strudel dough on this very table until it was thin enough to read a newspaper through. That was an archaic tradition. My grandmother's sourdough starter, which I'd kept alive for 50 years, feeding it every single day. An archaic tradition. Then there was David's quote, right below hers. We took a solid foundation and breathed new life into it, reimagining what a neighborhood bakery could be. We're making it relevant for a new generation. A solid foundation. He said it like he'd found an abandoned building with good bones. Not a life, not a legacy, a foundation. A thing you pour concrete over to build something new. The words were a series of small, sharp stabs, each one carefully chosen, each one designed to diminish, to reduce, to erase. Something inside me shifted. The numbness began to recede, replaced by a slow-burning question. Was I the only one who saw this? Was I just a bitter old woman, clinging to a past no one else cared about? I stood up and went to the little desk in the corner of the living room. I opened my old laptop. It whirred and groaned as it came to life, a dinosaur in this modern age. I wasn't good with computers, but I knew how to search. The brochure mentioned a rave review from a famous food critic. I typed his name into the search bar, along with the bakery's name. His most recent tweet popped up, posted just an hour ago. Congratulations to David and Amanda at Eleanor's Hearth on their big win tonight. An impressive and well-deserved award for a truly remarkable business case. I stared at the screen. Business case. Not remarkable bread. Not soulful pastries. Not best apple cake in the state. A business case. It was the coldest phrase he could have possibly used. It was Amanda's language, the language of profit margins and brand synergy. It was the language that had consumed my son. And then a memory flickered, a different article. Years ago, before David and Amanda took over, before the new era, I started digging. My fingers, clumsy on the keyboard, typed in the critic's name again, but this time I added the year, 5 years ago. I scrolled past pages of results. My heart was starting to beat faster now. I wasn't just sitting anymore. I was hunting. And then I found it. A link to an old blog post on his website. The headline read, "Eleanor's Hearth. This isn't a bakery. It's a time machine." I clicked it. The page loaded slowly. I dragged the window so it was side by side with his new tweet. On the right, the cold corporate praise of a business case. On the left, his words from 5 years ago. I began to read them out loud, my voice a dry whisper in the silent house. To walk into Eleanor's is to walk into the kitchen of every grandmother you've ever loved. This is not a place of business. It is a place of legacy. Every bite of the apple cake, a secret recipe, she tells me with a wink, is like having a conversation with her own grandmother, a woman I've never met, but feel I know intimately through the taste of cinnamon and browned butter. Eleanor isn't just baking bread, she's keeping memories alive. She's the guardian of a sacred trust. Legacy. Business case. The two phrases stared at me from the screen, black and white. Proof. It wasn't my imagination. It wasn't my bitterness. It was real. The world had seen it too. They hadn't just forgotten to thank me. They had consciously, deliberately, and successfully killed the legacy and built a business case on its corpse. I didn't feel triumph. I felt a profound, bottomless sadness. It was the grief you feel for a death, the death of the story, my story. And in that cold, quiet kitchen, with the glow of the laptop screen lighting up my face, a new feeling finally took root. It wasn't anger. It was something harder, something colder. It was resolve. It was the instinct for survival. If they had killed my story, then I would have to be the one to resurrect it. Not for them, not for the critic, not even for the memory of my mother, for me. For the girl who thought her hands, covered in flour and butter, were building something that could never be erased. Insouciant. I closed the laptop. The small click of the lid shutting echoed in the kitchen. It was a sound of finality, like closing a book after reading the last page. The screen was dark, but the two phrases still hung in the air in front of me. Legacy. Business case. My hands were resting on the cool surface of the kitchen table. I looked at them. They looked like a stranger's hands, old, spotted, the knuckles swollen slightly with arthritis. For the last 5 years, since I'd handed the daily operations over to David, these hands had felt retired. They gardened, they knitted, they held mugs of tea, but they hadn't felt like my hands. They had forgotten the language of flour and water, the heat of the ovens, the precise weight of a perfectly formed loaf. But now, sitting there in the silence, a different kind of memory was waking up in them, a memory of signing things, of checks for supplies, of loan applications, of the deed to this very house, and something else, something I hadn't thought about in decades. I stood up, my movements slow and deliberate, and walked back to the small desk in the living room. It was my husband's old desk, a heavy oak thing I'd never had the heart to get rid of. The top was neat bills paid, a few letters, a calendar, but the bottom right-hand drawer was locked. It had been locked for as long as I could remember. It was where I kept the important things, the documents that chart a life, birth certificates, my marriage license, my husband's death certificate, the things you put away and pray you never have to look at again. The key was in the little ceramic pot where I kept old pens. It was small and brass, its edges worn smooth. It slid into the lock with a familiar grating sound. I turned it, and the lock clicked open with a sound that was surprisingly loud in the quiet room. The drawer smelled of old paper and cedar wood. It was a time capsule. My whole life was in this drawer, filed away in brittle, yellowing envelopes. I saw my parents' wedding photo, a small, black and white square of two smiling young people who had no idea what the world had in store for them. I saw my first grade report card. Miss Gable had written, "Eleanor is a quiet child, but very determined." My fingers, clumsy with a feeling I couldn't name, moved past these ghosts. I was looking for a different kind of ghost, the ghost of a business. It was at the very back, in a stiff manila folder that had turned a dark, dusty brown at the edges. I pulled it out. There was no label on it. I didn't need one. I knew what it was. I carried it back to the kitchen table, like I was carrying a sacred text. I sat down and opened it. The papers inside were thin, almost translucent with age. They were held together with a single, slightly rusted staple. The top page was a business registration form, filed with the county clerk's office. The date at the top was written in the faint blue ink of a typewriter. April 17th, 32 years ago. I read the words, my finger tracing them as I went. Name of business, Eleanor's Hearth. Type of business, sole proprietorship. And then, the line that mattered. The line that David and Amanda, with all their marketing plans and their glossy brochures, had forgotten. Name of proprietor, Eleanor Vance. My name, not my husband's name. Not a corporate entity, just my name. I was the business, and the business was me. Legally, fundamentally, irrevocably. We were one and the same. I remembered the day I filed it. I'd taken the bus downtown. David was a little boy then, in first grade. I'd been so proud and so terrified. I had $50,000 in debt from the bank loan and a book of my mother's recipes. That was it. That was all I had. And my name, tucked behind the registration form, was another document. The trademark registration for the name Eleanor's Hearth, and the simple logo I had sketched myself, a stylized loaf of bread rising over a simple hand-drawn heart. The renewal date was stamped on it, over and over, every 10 years. The last one was from 2 years ago. I'd renewed it myself, online, a small administrative task I'd never bothered to tell David about. It was my name, after all. It seemed only right that I be the one to protect it. He'd changed the logo, of course. Amanda had hired a graphic designer. The new one was sleek and minimalist. It had no heart. I sat there, looking at those papers, and the cold resolve in my chest hardened into something that felt like steel. They had built their glittering business case on my foundation, but they had made a critical mistake. They thought the foundation was just the recipes. They thought it was just the building. They didn't understand the foundation was me. I closed the folder. My hands were no longer shaking. They felt strong. They felt like my own again. I walked over to the shelf where I kept my old, worn address book. It was a little blue book, the cover soft with use, the alphabet tabs frayed. I flipped through the pages, past the names of friends who were long gone, until my finger stopped on the letter J. Jensen. Arthur, attorney at law. Arthur had been a young man just starting out when he handled the paperwork for the bakery all those years ago. He was an old man now, like me. His son ran the practice mostly, but Arthur still kept an office. He'd handled my will after my husband died. He was the only lawyer I'd ever trusted. I looked at the cat clock on the wall. It was almost 2 in the morning. Too late to call. A normal person would wait until morning. I picked up the phone. I dialed the number from memory. It rang 4 times, and then his voice, gravelly with sleep, came on the line. It wasn't the office voicemail. It was him. "Jensen, Arthur," I said. My own voice sounded calm, steady, unfamiliar. "It's Eleanor Vance." There was a pause. I could hear him shifting, the sound of a bedside lamp clicking on. "Ellie, good Lord, is everything all right?" I looked at the folder on my kitchen table. I looked at my hands, and for the first time all night, I felt the faintest shadow of a smile touch my lips. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the smile of Miss Gable's quiet, determined little girl. "No, Arthur," I said, my voice perfectly clear. "Everything is not all right." I paused, letting the weight of those words settle between us. "But it's going to be nigh." That phone call to Arthur Jensen was like throwing a rock into a still pond. The morning after, the ripples started. He called me back at 9 o'clock sharp. His voice was all business now, the sleepiness gone. He confirmed everything I'd found in that dusty folder. The business name, Eleanor's Hearth, was mine. The trademark was mine, active and in good standing. The original sole proprietorship was never legally dissolved, just abandoned, like an old house nobody lived in anymore. David had formed a new corporation, a limited liability company, to run the business, but he had done so using my name, my brand, my goodwill. Arthur called it infringement. He used words like cease and desist, injunction, damages. He said we had a very strong case. He laid out a plan, a letter from his office, a legal battle, a fight for control. I listened to him, and a part of me felt a surge of cold power. Yes, this was justice. But after we hung up, a different feeling settled in, a hollow, aching emptiness. I imagined the letter arriving, the look on David's face, the panicked phone call. I imagined courtrooms and depositions. I would win. Arthur was sure of it. I would get my name back. But what would be left? A name on a building? A pile of money from a settlement? It felt like a victory, but a sterile one. He had stolen my story, and my response was going to be a legal document? It didn't feel right. It felt like fighting a fire with a stack of papers. The law could give me back my property, but it couldn't give me back my history. It couldn't correct the memory he had erased. For days, I was paralyzed. I had this powerful weapon, this legal truth, but I had no idea how to use it in a way that would actually heal the wound. I thought about writing a letter to the editor of the local paper. I even started one. I sat at my kitchen table, a blank sheet of paper in front of me, a pen in my hand. To the editor, I wrote. And then I stopped. What would I say? My son, the celebrated business owner of the year, is a liar and a thief? It would sound like the ravings of a bitter, forgotten old woman. People would read it and feel pity. Or worse, they'd roll their eyes. Amanda and David would issue a statement full of corporate speak about a regrettable family misunderstanding and my confusion. They would paint me as senile, as someone who couldn't accept change. They would win that fight before it even began. I crumpled the paper and threw it away. The feeling of helplessness was worse than the initial shock of the betrayal. It was like I was trapped behind a pane of soundproof glass. I could see the world. I could see the lie. But I couldn't make a sound that anyone would actually hear. One afternoon, staring into a cup of cold tea, I thought of Lucy, that sweet girl from the bakery, the one David had kept on from my team, probably because she was young and worked hard for low pay. I remembered her eyes, how they would light up when I'd show her the old way of kneading, the way you feel the dough come alive in your hands. She was the only one who ever asked about the why of the recipes, not just the how. I didn't have a plan. I just needed to talk to someone who knew the difference between legacy and a business case. My hand trembled a little as I found her number in my old address book. I felt foolish, like I was bothering her. She was probably busy. She answered on the second ring, her voice bright and cheerful. "Mrs. Eleanor? Is everything okay?" And for the first time since that horrible night, the dam broke. I didn't mean to, but I told her everything. The words just poured out of me in a jumbled, tearful mess. The speech, the brochure, the critic's review, the coldness in David's eyes. I told her I felt like a ghost in my own life. She was quiet on the other end of the line, just listening. She didn't interrupt. She didn't offer empty platitudes. When I finally ran out of words, there was a long pause. "He's an idiot," she said finally. Her voice was flat, angry. "They both are. They're changing everything. Amanda made us switch to a cheaper vanilla extract last week. Said it wouldn't affect the customer experience. The whole place is starting to smell fake." And then she said the words that changed everything. "Mrs. Eleanor," she said, her voice soft now, but fierce. "They took the bakery. They took the name. But they can't take your hands. They can't take what's in your head. People need to see that. Not just read about it in some newspaper. They need to see you. See me." The idea was terrifying, but it was also like a single bright match struck in a dark room. The next evening, Lucy came over after her shift. She was still in her uniform, a faint dusting of flour on her black apron. "Okay," she said, holding up her phone. "Let's try something. Let's just make something. I'll film it. I can put it on my Instagram. My friends will see it." The idea was modest, small. It felt manageable. We went into my kitchen. I decided to make my mother's cinnamon twists. It was the first thing I ever learned to bake. I pulled out the ingredients, my hands moving with a memory of their own. But the moment Lucy pointed the phone at me, I froze. The little red light was on. I suddenly felt foolish, a silly old woman playing make-believe in her kitchen. You start with the flour," I stammered, my voice thin. "And you add the sugar." The video was a disaster. The lighting in my kitchen was dim and yellow. The phone camera was shaky in Lucy's hand. My voice was a nervous whisper. We watched it back, the two of us huddled over the tiny screen. We looked at each other, and then we started to laugh. It wasn't a happy laugh. It was a laugh that said, "Well, that was a terrible idea. It's no good," I said, wiping a tear of laughter from my eye. "I look like I'm being held hostage." "No," Lucy said, her brow furrowed in thought as she scrolled through her phone. "The idea isn't wrong. The place is wrong. Instagram is too fast, too noisy. Your story needs its own room, a quiet place." She kept scrolling. "It needs a website. A simple one, like an online cookbook, but instead of just recipes, it's your memories. A page for the cinnamon twists with the recipe and the story about your mother. A page for the apple cake with the recipe and the story about the county fair. We could call it Eleanor's Real Hearth." The idea settled over me, not with a jolt, but with a quiet, gentle warmth. A book, an online book of my life. It felt right. It felt dignified. It felt like me. And so began the project. It wasn't a Hollywood montage. There was no upbeat music. It was slow, painstaking work that filled the corners of our days. For the next 3 weeks, every evening, I would sit at my kitchen table after dinner. I had a new notebook, a simple, spiral-bound one, and I would write. I would write down the story of a recipe, not just the ingredients and instructions, but the life that surrounded it. I wrote about my father, a big, quiet man, and how he would sneak into the kitchen late at night to steal one of my oatmeal raisin cookies, thinking no one noticed. I wrote about the first time my husband, Robert, tasted my strawberry rhubarb pie, and how he told me right then and there he was going to marry me. The stories were locked away inside me, and the pen was the key. My handwriting was a bit shaky, but the words were clear. Every other night, after her shift, Lucy would come over. She'd be tired, her feet aching, but she would pull out her laptop and set it up on the table. She found a simple website template. It was clean and white, with a place for pictures and a place for text. It's like a paint-by-numbers picture, she explained. We just have to fill it in. We were a clumsy, unlikely team. I, who thought the cloud was something in the sky, and she, who was patient enough to explain what a domain name was for the 3rd time. We watched tutorials on YouTube, propped up on the sugar canister. How to take good food photos with your phone. We learned that natural light was best, so we spent a whole Saturday baking and taking pictures by the big window in my living room. We stacked old cookbooks to make a makeshift tripod for her phone. During those weeks, my kitchen came back to life. The air was constantly filled with the scent of cinnamon, or melting chocolate, or caramelizing sugar. It wasn't a factory anymore. It was my kitchen again. And as I told the stories, as I wrote them down and then watched Lucy type them onto the screen, I felt something stitching itself back together inside me. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about remembering. It was therapy, a tablespoon of sugar at a time. Finally, one Tuesday night, it was ready. The site was simple. The name at the top read, Eleanor's Hearth, the real story. There were 5 entries: the oatmeal, raisin cookies, the strawberry rhubarb pie, the county fair apple cake, my mother's cinnamon twists, and my grandmother's sourdough. Each one had a simple, well-lit photo, my handwritten recipe scanned and uploaded, and the story I had written out. It was amateurish, maybe, but it was honest. Every word, every picture was true. Lucy had her finger on the mouse, the cursor hovering over a button that said, Publish. The whole world was contained in that one word. She looked at me, her young face serious in the glow of the screen. Ready? She asked softly. I took a deep breath. The kitchen smelled of the cinnamon twists we had baked that afternoon. I nodded. I couldn't speak. She clicked the button. There was no fanfare. No confetti fell from the ceiling. The screen refreshed, and the site looked exactly the same. But now, it was live. It was out there. A tiny, quiet boat pushed out into a roaring ocean. We just sat there for a moment, the two of us, in the quiet hum of the laptop. The sense of accomplishment I expected to feel wasn't there. In its place was a vast, terrifying vulnerability. I looked at the screen, at my life laid bare for anyone to see, and a single, cold thought crept into my mind. What if nobody reads it? There was happened. The first week was a lesson in silence. After Lucy hit publish, we fell into a strange, anxious routine. I'd wake up in the morning, make my tea, and the first thing I'd do was open the laptop. Lucy had shown me how to see the visitor count. The first day, it was 27. Most of those were probably Lucy's friends, whom she had texted the link to with a message full of heart emojis. A few kind comments appeared at the bottom of the sourdough story. "This is so beautiful. Thank you for sharing. What a lovely memory." They were sweet, but they felt like polite notes left in a guest book at a funeral. I checked the counter every hour. 35, 42. By the end of the week, it had stalled at 112. The number just sat there, staring at me, a monument to my foolishness. I had told my deepest stories to 100 strangers, and then the world had moved on. The silence was deafening. I started to think that David and Amanda were right. I was an archaic tradition. I was irrelevant. A quiet old woman with her quiet old stories that nobody had time for. The hope that had bloomed in my chest during those weeks of writing began to wither. I'd call Lucy in the evenings, trying to sound cheerful. "Any new visitors?" she'd ask, her voice bright with a hope I no longer felt. "A couple?" I'd lie. The second week, the silence was broken by a single, unexpected voice. Her name was Brenda. I learned this later. She was a woman in her late 40s who lived 3 towns over. She wasn't a professional food critic, just a mom who ran a small, local food blog called Brenda's Kitchen Table. It wasn't famous, but it was loved. She had a few thousand followers, mostly other moms, who trusted her because she was honest and she wasn't trying to sell them anything. Apparently, one of her readers had sent her the link to my website, and Brenda, out of curiosity, had clicked. She read the story of the county fair apple cake. Then she baked it. On a Thursday morning, Lucy called me, her voice fizzing with an energy I hadn't heard in days. "Mrs. Eleanor, you need to look at this right now." She sent me a link. It was to Brenda's blog. There was a beautiful, rustic photo of a slice of apple cake on a simple white plate. The crust was golden brown. The apples were glistening. It looked exactly like my mother's cake. And then there were the words. Brenda wrote, "Friends, I need to tell you a story. For the past year, I've been a fan of the artisanal apple tart from the award-winning Eleanor's Hearth. I thought I knew what a good apple pastry tasted like. I was wrong. Yesterday, I stumbled upon a small, quiet website. It's run by a woman named Eleanor Vance, the original Eleanor. And on that site, she shares her mother's original recipe for apple cake. I baked it this morning. Let me be clear, this is not the same pastry you buy in that fancy shop. This isn't even in the same universe. One is a product expertly marketed and beautifully packaged. The other is magic. It's a memory you didn't even know you had. I think I finally understand the difference between a good business case and a great legacy. Thank you, Eleanor, for sharing a piece of your heart. You can find her story here." She posted the link. By that evening, my visitor counter, which had been stuck at 112, read 4,387. The comments started pouring in, not just on my site, but on Brenda's post. Dozens of them. "I'm making this tomorrow. Thank you for sharing this, Brenda. What a story." Amanda saw the post, of course. Lucy told me later that she'd printed it out and brought it into the office. She showed it to David, and according to Lucy, who overheard them from the bake shop, they laughed. It was a dismissive, patronizing laugh. "Oh, look," Amanda had said, her voice dripping with condescension. "Your mother's found a little hobby. Isn't that sweet?" A few local housewives are getting nostalgic. They decided it was beneath them. A blip, she called it. They were a brand. They were above a little kitchen table blog. They decided the best strategy was to ignore it completely. That was their second mistake. Their first was forgetting who owned the name. Their second was underestimating the power of 1,000 kitchen tables. Brenda's post was a spark, but the third week, it landed in a tinderbox. Someone shared her blog post in a massive Facebook group called Foodies of Our City. It had over 50,000 members. And suddenly, the story was no longer just about me. It became about everyone. The discussion exploded. People who remembered the bakery from before started chiming in. "I knew it," one woman wrote. "It used to be so much better. The croissants used to be flaky. Now they're just doughy." Another added, "That place used to have so much soul. Now it feels like a chain." Then came the anonymous comment that turned the snowball into an avalanche. It was from someone with a blank profile picture. "I used to work there," the comment began. "Left 6 months ago. We were told to start using a cheaper butter blend instead of pure butter to manage costs. And we were told to stop using the old sourdough starter because the fermentation was inconsistent, and they wanted a dye, more uniform product. We use commercial yeast now. The soul isn't just gone, it was deliberately removed." That one comment unleashed a torrent. The conversation shifted from nostalgia to outrage. It wasn't just a family drama anymore. It was a story about a beloved local business deceiving its customers. It was about quality, authenticity, and the betrayal of trust. That's when the comments started appearing on their official Instagram page. Underneath a glossy, professional photo of their artisanal apple tart, people were writing, "Is this made with the original recipe? Why did you switch to cheap butter? We want Eleanor's cake." Amanda's strategy of ignoring the problem escalated to active suppression. Lucy told me their social media manager was working overtime, frantically deleting comments and blocking users. But for every comment they deleted, 5 more appeared. It was like trying to scoop water out of a sinking boat with a teaspoon. That's when my phone rang. It was David. His voice wasn't condescending anymore. It was tight, strained with irritation. "Mom, what are you doing?" he asked, without even a hello. "Hello, David," I said calmly, my heart beating a steady, slow rhythm. "This has to stop," he said, his voice rising. "This website, this whole thing, it's not funny anymore. You're embarrassing us. You're putting the business in an awkward position." I took a sip of my tea. It was warm. I felt calm. "I'm not doing anything to your business, David," I said, my voice even. "I'm just telling my own story. The recipes are mine. The memories are mine. Surely I'm allowed to share what belongs to me." He was silent for a moment. He was used to me being soft, accommodating. He didn't know what to do with this new quiet strength. "You don't understand," he finally sputtered. "This is more complicated than your little stories." "No, David," I said. "It's actually very simple." And I hung up. The climax came 2 days later. It came in the form of an email. The sender was a young man named Ben Carter, a journalist from a national online news magazine. They were known for their deep-dive investigative pieces. Ben wrote that he'd been following the Eleanor's Hearth controversy on social media and that he thought there was a much bigger story here. A story about family, legacy, and the corporatization of small businesses in America. He wanted to talk to me. I spoke to Arthur. I spoke to Lucy. And then I wrote back to Ben Carter and said yes. He was thorough. He was relentless. He interviewed me for hours. He spoke to Lucy. He found Brenda, the food blogger. He even found the anonymous ex-employee who agreed to speak on the record. He dug up the old business filings, confirming my sole proprietorship. He pulled David and Amanda's marketing materials, highlighting their language about breaking with tradition. He built his case, piece by piece, with facts, The article went live on a Friday morning. The headline was devastating: How the Bakery of the Year Erased Its Own Founder, an investigation into Eleanor's hearth. It was a nuclear bomb. The story didn't just get shared, it went viral. It was on Twitter, on Facebook, on the national news. My little website, which had celebrated a few thousand hits, crashed from the sheer volume of traffic. And that's when the final phone call came. I was in my kitchen, kneading dough for a simple loaf of white bread, just for myself. My hands were covered in flour. The phone rang, and I answered it on speaker. It was David, and the irritation was gone. The condescension was gone. All that was left was raw, undiluted panic. "What did you do?" he screamed into the phone. His voice was ragged, cracking. I could hear Amanda in the background, sobbing. "The phones won't stop ringing. Our investors are calling. The morning news shows are here. They're calling me a thief. You've ruined everything we built." I stopped kneading. I looked at my hands, white with flour, the substance that had started it all. I looked out the window at my small garden. The world felt very quiet, very still. He was still yelling, a long, desperate torrent of blame and fury. He didn't understand. He still didn't understand that he hadn't built anything. He had only occupied a space that I had built. He was a tenant in my house. I waited until he had exhausted himself, until his shouting subsided into ragged breaths. "I didn't ruin anything, David," I said, and my voice was no longer the voice of a mother. It was calm. It was cold. It was the voice of a woman who owned the truth. "You did this, Staples." After that final, desperate phone call from David, a strange sort of peace settled over my house, even as the world outside erupted. My phone began to ring constantly, but it wasn't him anymore. It was reporters, producers from morning talk shows, people from radio stations. My email inbox, which I checked with Lucy's help, was flooded. Hundreds, then thousands, of messages from strangers. They sent me pictures of their own grandmothers. They told me about their families' recipes. They shared their own stories of feeling erased, of being overlooked. It was overwhelming, a tidal wave of shared memory and emotion. My little website, my quiet little boat, had found an entire fleet waiting for it in the ocean. Amidst the flood of messages, one stood out. It was from a woman named Maria, the director of the local community center, a humble brick building down by the park where they held potlucks and bingo nights. She didn't ask for an interview or a scoop. She asked for something else. "Dear Eleanor," she wrote, "your story has touched so many of us here. I was wondering if you would ever consider teaching a class, a simple baking class. Our community kitchen is small, but it's warm. So many people want to learn not just how to bake, but how to connect with the kind of history you represent. We can't pay you much, but we can promise you a room full of eager students. A class." The idea terrified me. I wasn't a teacher. I was a baker. I worked with my hands, not with my words. But then I looked around my quiet kitchen. For the first time in years, it had a purpose again. But it was just one kitchen. Maria was offering me another. I said yes. We decided the first class would be on the heart of it all: sourdough. My grandmother's starter, the one that was nearly a century old, the living, breathing legacy that David and Amanda had dismissed as inconsistent. Lucy helped me make the flyer. It was simple, with a picture of a round, flour-dusted loaf. "Learn to bake sourdough with Eleanor Vance," it said. "A free masterclass on the story of bread." The class was scheduled for a Saturday afternoon. The community center kitchen could comfortably hold about 15 people. By Wednesday, Maria called me. her voice a mix of excitement and panic. Over 200 people had signed up. They had to move the event to the main hall, a large room with a scuffed wooden floor and a small stage. They would bring in a long table and a portable oven. The morning of the class, I was so nervous my hands were shaking. I felt like a fraud. What if I forgot something? What if I bored them all? Lucy came over early to help me pack. We loaded my car with huge bags of Frank's best flour. He had insisted on donating it, bowls, my old, scarred wooden dough board, and, most importantly, the starter. I carried the crock that held the bubbling, living starter myself, cradling it in my lap like a precious child. When we arrived, the parking lot was full. The main hall was packed. People were standing in the back, leaning against the walls. There were young people with tattoos and bright hair, mothers with toddlers, and men and women my own age who looked at me with a soft, knowing recognition in their eyes. The room buzzed with a gentle, expectant energy. It wasn't the hungry, sharp energy of the awards banquet. This was something different. It was warm. I stood on the little stage behind the long table, a microphone clipped to my collar. I looked out at all those faces, and my fear simply evaporated. I wasn't there to perform. I was there to share. "Hello," I said, and my voice, amplified by the speakers, was steady. "My name is Eleanor. And this," I said, holding up the crock of sourdough starter, "is my grandmother, Agnes. Well, a part of her, anyway." A soft laugh went through the room. For the next 2 hours, I didn't just teach, I told stories. As I mixed the flour and water, I talked about the science of fermentation, but I also talked about my grandmother's hands, how they were never still. As I demonstrated the kneading, the folding and turning of the dough, I told them about the rhythm of a baker's life, the pre-dawn quiet, the satisfaction of a perfectly baked loaf. I let people come up and feel the dough, to understand the life in it. I showed them how to feed the starter, explaining that it was a commitment, a relationship. "You have to tend to it," I said, "or it will die, just like any memory." The room was rapt. People weren't just watching me, they were with me. We were all in my grandmother's kitchen together. When the loaf I had prepared earlier came out of the portable oven, golden and fragrant, a spontaneous applause broke out. The smell of real bread filled the hall. After the class officially ended, people didn't leave. They crowded around the stage, asking questions, sharing their own baking failures and triumphs, thanking me. A young woman with tears in her eyes told me I reminded her of her Polish grandmother. An older man shook my hand and said, "I remember your bakery from the old days. Thank you for bringing it back." I was surrounded, not by fans, but by neighbors, by a community. My hands were covered in a fine white dust of flour, and I had never felt more myself. And then I saw him. David was standing at the edge of the crowd. He wasn't wearing a suit, but expensive jeans and a tailored cashmere sweater that looked completely out of place against the peeling paint of the community hall. He looked tired. There were dark circles under his eyes. He was trying to project an air of calm, but his jaw was clenched tight. He was waiting, watching me with a look I couldn't quite decipher. He waited until there was a small gap in the people around me, and then he moved forward. "Mom," he said, his voice low, urgent. "We need to talk privately." A few people nearby heard him and turned to look. I smiled at the woman I had been talking to and then looked at my son. My hands were still white with flour. I made no move to wipe them. "I'm talking with my friends right now, David," I said, my voice gentle but firm. His face tightened. This wasn't going according to his plan. He glanced around at the curious faces watching us. He lowered his voice even more, leaning in, a conspiratorial, desperate edge to his tone. "This has gone far enough," he hissed. The words meant only for me, but the tension was visible to everyone. "This whole circus, it's destroying everything. I'm here to make it right. Just stop. I'll pay you. Name your price. How much do you want to shut down the website and stop all this?" The words hung in the air. The small circle of people around me fell silent. They had heard. A woman holding a paper plate with a slice of my bread on it stared at him, her mouth slightly open. The question was so crude, so transactional, it felt like a curse word spoken in a church. I looked at David, at his expensive sweater, his desperate eyes, his clean, uncalloused hands, and in that moment, the last bit of anger I had been holding on to, the last ember of personal hurt, finally turned to ash. All I felt was a vast, hollow pity. He still didn't understand. After everything, he still thought this was about money. He was speaking the only language he knew, a language of invoices and profit margins, and he couldn't comprehend that I was now living in a country where that currency was worthless. I raised my hands, holding them up between us. They were the hands of an old woman, wrinkled and spotted, but they were covered in the evidence of creation, of life. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The silence in the room was absolute. "David," I said, and my voice was clear and carried through the quiet hall. "You still think everything has a price tag. You still think everything is for sale." I looked from my hands to his face, then gestured with my chin to the crowd, to the people holding my bread, to the warm, flower-scented air of the room. "But how do you buy this?" I asked, my voice soft, but sharp as a knife. "How do you buy what I just gave away to all these people for free? I'm not selling recipes, David. I'm giving people back their memories, their own memories, of their own grandmothers. Try and put a price on that." He had no answer. He just stood there, his face pale. The judgment of the crowd was a palpable thing, a silent, heavy wave of disapproval. They weren't glaring at him with hatred. They were looking at him with a kind of sad confusion, as if he were a man speaking a foreign language they couldn't possibly understand. He was an outsider here, in this room. He was the one who was irrelevant. He looked at me, and for the first time, I think he saw me, not as his mother, not as a problem to be managed, but as a person who had something he could never, ever possess: respect, love, a purpose that couldn't be quantified on a balance sheet. He had the award, the brand, the LLC. I had the legacy, and he finally understood that he had made the worst trade of his life. He didn't say another word. He just turned, his shoulders slumped, and walked away. The crowd parted for him silently, a sea of quiet judgment. He walked out of the hall and back into his world of price tags and business cases. I watched him go. And then I looked down at my hands, still covered in flour. I was finally, completely free. And David's retreat from the community center wasn't a loud explosion. It was a quiet, final closing of a door. There were no more angry phone calls, no letters from lawyers. A week later, a long, rambling email arrived in my inbox. It was from him. It wasn't an apology, not a real one. It was a self-pitying justification full of phrases like market pressures and brand evolution and the difficult decisions a CEO has to make. He blamed Amanda. He blamed the investors. He blamed the changing tastes of the modern consumer. He blamed everyone but himself. He ended by saying he hoped that one day I would understand what he was trying to achieve. I read it once, and then I deleted it. It was the last I heard from him. The world, however, did not fall silent. The story of the masterclass, of David's clumsy attempt to buy my silence, went almost as viral as the original article. People saw it for what it was: the perfect, final scene in the drama, the quiet triumph of authenticity over commerce. My website, Eleanor's Real Hearth, became a destination. The visitor counter ticked into the hundreds of thousands, then millions. People from all over the world were leaving comments, sharing their own stories, and my life, which for years had been shrinking, contained within the four walls of my house, began to expand in ways I could never have imagined. It started with the emails. They came from everywhere. A young man in Oregon who had inherited his grandmother's cast iron skillet and was using my recipes to teach himself how to cook. A woman in Australia who was using my sourdough starter instructions to create her own, naming it Eleanor in honor of me. A soldier stationed in Germany who said my stories made him feel closer to a home he desperately missed. Lucy, who had become my unofficial partner in this whole adventure, came over one evening with a large corkboard and a box of colored pins. "We need to see it," she said, her eyes shining. "We need to see what you've done." We unrolled a map of the world and pinned it to my living room wall. For every email we received from a new city or country, we would push a pin into the map. London, Toronto, Tokyo. A tiny town in the mountains of Peru, a suburb of Johannesburg. Within a month, the map was a galaxy of tiny, bright stars. My small kitchen, my small life, had reached all these places. My grandmother's hands were, in a way, kneading dough all over the world. The masterclass at the community center wasn't a one-time event. Maria called and said they'd been flooded with requests for more. So I did another, and another. We had to set up a lottery system for the tickets, which remained free. I taught people how to make my mother's flaky pie crust. I taught them the secrets to a perfect sponge cake. I didn't just share recipes. I shared the history that lived inside them. One afternoon, I received a call from a woman in New York with a crisp, professional voice. She was a publisher. She had read my website from start to finish. She said, "Mrs. Vance, your stories deserve to be a book, not just a cookbook, a memoir, the story of a life told through flour and sugar." A book. Me, an author. The idea was as foreign as the idea of being a website owner had been just a few months prior. But I thought of my notebook, the one filled with my shaky handwriting. I thought of all the stories I still had to tell, and I said yes. My life found a new rhythm. Mornings were for writing. Sitting at my kitchen table, a cup of tea growing cold beside me as I journeyed back into my own past. Afternoons were for baking, for testing the recipes for the book, for answering emails with Lucy's help. My quiet, empty house was now a global headquarters of memory. It was filled with purpose. The hollowness that had taken root in my chest after David's betrayal was gone. It had been filled, spoonful by spoonful, with connection and meaning. I didn't become rich. The book deal came with a modest advance, enough to fix my leaky roof and live comfortably. The classes were always free. That was my one non-negotiable rule. This wasn't a business. It was a movement, a quiet, gentle rebellion against a world that was becoming too fast, too processed, too fake. It was a movement about returning to our own kitchens, to our own histories. And what of Eleanor's Hearth, the business? Lucy kept me updated. About 6 months after our last conversation, they announced a major rebranding. The name was officially changed to Hearth Modern Baking. My name, Eleanor, was scrubbed from the signs, from the boxes, from the website. It was the final, official act of erasure. They abandoned all my recipes. The new menu was full of trendy, Instagram-friendly things: charcoal croissants, matcha lavender macarons, deconstructed cheesecakes in little glass jars. The reviews were polite, visually stunning, an interesting flavor profile, but the word soul was never used again. They didn't go out of business. They survived. But they became just another place. One of a dozen slick, modern bakeries in the city, indistinguishable from the rest. They had won the battle for the storefront, but they had lost the war for its heart. Their foundation was gone, and they were now just a pretty facade, built on nothing. One evening, I received a letter in the mail, a real letter, on thick, creamy paper, the handwriting elegant and careful. It was from a young woman in Chicago, named Sarah. "Dear Mrs. Vance," it began, "I have been following your story since the beginning. I was a young pastry chef, working in a high-end restaurant where I was miserable. We were encouraged to be artists, but not artisans. It was all about foam and air, and things that looked pretty, but tasted of nothing. Your website reminded me why I fell in love with baking in the first place, to make people feel happy and cared for. 2 months ago, I quit my job. I used my savings to rent a tiny little storefront in my neighborhood. I bake simple things: sourdough bread, apple cakes, oatmeal cookies. I use your recipes, which you so generously shared with the world. I don't have a marketing budget or a fancy logo, but the shop is always full. I wanted you to know that I have named it Eleanor's Apprentice. I hope you don't mind. It is my promise to my customers and to myself to always honor the legacy of real baking." I sat in my armchair, the letter in my hand, and I wept, not with sadness, not with anger, but with a profound, overwhelming sense of peace. I looked at the map on my wall, glittering with its constellation of pins. I thought of Sarah in Chicago, a student I had never met. I thought of the young man in Oregon, learning to cook in his grandmother's skillet. My legacy wasn't a building on a street corner. It wasn't a brand name. It wasn't one person, my son, who had failed to carry it. My legacy was alive. It was bubbling away on 1,000 countertops around the world. It was being passed from hand to hand, from kitchen to kitchen. It could never be sold or rebranded or erased, because it was no longer mine alone. It belonged to everyone. I stood up and went into the kitchen. The late afternoon sun was streaming through the window, illuminating the dancing dust motes in the air. I looked down at my hands, the hands that had started it all. They were old, but they were not retired. I took out a large bowl, a bag of flour, and the crock of sourdough starter. I had a book to finish. I had a world to feed, and I was just getting started. There is how. A year passed. A year is a long time. It's long enough for seasons to change, for a garden to be planted and harvested, for a sourdough starter to be shared 100 times over. It's long enough for a new life to feel not so new anymore, but simply normal. My book, Eleanor's Hearth, My Life in Recipes, was published. It wasn't a bestseller that topped the charts, but it found its way into the hands that needed it. People would send me pictures of its pages, dusted with flour, stained with vanilla, the signs of a well-loved book. The map on my wall now glittered with pins, so many that entire continents were just shimmering patches of color. My world, once confined to a single street, had become boundless. The rhythm of my days was gentle. I would write, I would bake, I would answer emails from people who were now my friends, my global community of apprentices. I still taught my free classes at the community center. My life was full, not with the frantic energy of running a business, but with the slow, steady satisfaction of purpose. The ghost of the old bakery, the pain of the betrayal, had faded. It was like a scar on one of my hands, a part of my history, a reminder of a lesson learned, but it no longer ached. Then, one Tuesday afternoon in early autumn, the past arrived in my mailbox. It was a single, cream-colored envelope, nestled between a seed catalog and a letter from my publisher. The return address was a new one, a house in a wealthy suburb I didn't recognize, but the name was David Vance. I took it inside and placed it on the kitchen table. I didn't open it right away. I made myself a cup of tea. I watched a blue jay bicker with a squirrel on the bird feeder outside my window. There was no anxiety, no dread. I felt only a mild, detached curiosity, the way you might feel upon finding an old, forgotten photograph in a drawer. Finally, I picked it up. My thumb slid under the flap and broke the seal. The paper inside was thick and expensive. The letter was short. It was not an apology. He wrote that a year was a long time, and that he hoped the unfortunate misunderstandings of the past could now be put behind us. He wrote that his children, my grandchildren, were growing up, and that they asked about me. He wrote that for their sake, it was time for a reconciliation. He suggested we could meet for lunch, find a way to rebuild the bridge. I read the words. I saw them for exactly what they were. It was a carefully constructed piece of manipulation, disguised as an olive branch. He hadn't changed. He was still trying to write a script, and he needed me to play my role, the forgiving mother, the benevolent grandmother who would smile for family photos and complete the picture of his successful, happy life. The story wasn't for me, or even for the children. It was for him. He needed to be the kind of man who had a good relationship with his mother. I put the letter down on the table, and I felt nothing. No anger, no surge of pain, no flicker of hope. It was like reading a weather report for a city I no longer lived in. The words had no power over me. The story he was trying to tell was no longer my story. He was a character in a book I had already finished reading. My gaze drifted from the letter to the bowl of lemons on my counter. I had been thinking all morning about a new recipe, a simple, buttery shortbread, but with a bright, unexpected twist. Lemon, perhaps? Or maybe orange? The idea was taking shape in my head, a little spark of creation. I needed to write it down before the inspiration faded. I looked around the kitchen table for a piece of paper. My notebook was in the living room. There were napkins, but the ink would bleed through. My eyes fell on the letter. A clean, empty space covered the back of the page. It was just a piece of paper, a tool. Without a second thought, without any sense of drama or ceremony, I picked it up and turned it over. David's carefully chosen, emotionally vacant words were now face down against the warm wood of my table. The blank side looked up at me, clean and white and full of possibility. I picked up my pen. The ink flowed smoothly onto the expensive paper. 2 cups all-purpose flour, 1/2 cup sugar, superfine, if possible 1 cup, unsalted butter, cold and cubed, pinch of salt. I paused, chewing on the end of my pen. I thought about the flavor. Lemon was classic but a bit sharp. I wanted something warmer, something that spoke of sunshine and quiet satisfaction, the taste of a life lived on one's own terms. My gaze fell on the back of the letter, on my own handwriting taking shape. His words were on the other side, an attempt to pull me back into a story of obligation and hurt. My words, on this side, were about creation, about moving forward. His letter was an anchor to the past. My recipe was a map to a pleasant afternoon. I knew then that I was truly free. My peace wasn't conditional on his apology. My happiness didn't require his understanding. My life was no longer a reaction to his. It was my own creation, built from my own ingredients, on my own terms. He could no longer hurt me because he was no longer a main character. He was just a piece of paper on my table. I smiled a small, quiet smile to myself. I knew what the recipe needed. I uncapped the pen and added a new line to the list of ingredients, my handwriting clear and steady over the faint, ghostly impression of his signature from the other side. Zest of one large orange. I looked down at the page, a perfect fusion of the past and the future. His attempt to control my narrative had literally become the foundation for my next creation. Yes, I whispered to the quiet, sun-drenched kitchen. Orange zest this time. My pen hovered for a moment longer, and then I wrote the final words at the bottom of the page. It's time to move on.